Welcome very much to the first panel of this conference, which will deal with, on the one hand, the causes and the drivers for differentiated integration, on the other hand, with the impact that differentiated integration has had, or maybe also will have in the future on the EU's polity. Before I introduce the panelists on this panel, I would like to remind all of the viewers of this panel, welcome as well. If you are commenting on the panel or on the whole conference, for example, on Twitter, to please use the hashtag InDivEU and to tag TEPSA as well. I would also like to stress again that InDivEU is a project that was funded by the European Commission through the Horizon 2020 project. Before I introduce the speakers, we would, of course, like to have a conversation not just among the panelists, but also with the audience. So I would encourage everyone to please raise their questions in the chat. And if you do so, maybe to also indicate who the question is for, whether you want to address someone specifically on the panel or whether it is a question to all panelists. Thank you very much. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce the speakers on the panel. So I'm very happy to introduce Micaela del Monte, who is head of the Citizens Policies Unit within the European Parliament's Directorate General for Parliamentary Research Services. We then have Marta Migliorati, who is at the Hertie School and currently a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. We also have Bruno de Witte, who is Professor of European Union Law at Maastricht University and at the EUI. And finally, we have Frank Schimmelfennig, whom you have already seen this morning, who is professor at the ETH Zürich and coordinates the InDivEU project together with Brigid Laffan. Welcome, everyone. We're very, very happy to have everyone here. So I would like to start with a question to Frank. You have done quite a lot of research also together with Thomas Vincent. It was mentioned already this morning on different aspects of differentiated integration in the EU. So where does it take place? In what form does it take? And what are the causes and the drivers for it? And especially regarding the last aspect, I would like you maybe to start us off with a short presentation on sort of what are the main explanations for the development of differentiated integration in the EU?
Yeah, thank you very much, Katrin. So, I mean, the main cause is already in the title of our project, diversity. And differentiated integration is basically integration in a context of diversity and trying to manage that diversity. So it has received its biggest boosts, let's say, from the increasing diversity of the membership of the European Union over time as the EU has enlarged. And it's basically the heterogeneity of member states' capacities to integrate, their financial, administrative capacity, but also diverse interests regarding, as we heard this morning, the destination of the European Union, so the finalité of European integration. It has also received a major boost because of the European Union's expanded policy portfolio. So it's, as the European Union has entered into more contested policy areas, more sensitive to national sovereignty, going beyond the market, that has also created a very strong incentive or need to move from uniform to differentiated integration. Now, in our research, what we found out is that there are two major types of heterogeneity that matter here. One is a divide between old and new member states, especially poorer new member states in the context of EU enlargement. And here the form that differentiated integration takes is multi-speed, the temporary exclusion of new member states from some rights and benefits out of concern of the old member states about issues like internal migration or the use of European Union funds, but also out of concern for about their potential lack of ability to comply with demanding EU policies. Think of external border protection, meeting the requirements for participating in the Eurozone, and so on. And the other major divide is about the integration of core state powers. More contested domains of European integration. And here it's rather the Eurosceptic, nationally oriented member states that demand opt-outs to safeguard their national sovereignty. And historically, what we see over time is that differentiated integration has really been a hallmark of a specific period of European integration, mainly the dynamic integration of the 1990s and 2000s, which, as we all know, were marked by the European Union's biggest enlargement rounds so far, and also by its expansion from market integration to the integration of core state powers. Also means that in recent years, this dynamic proliferation of differentiation has mitigated somewhat, and you could say that that has to do with the slowdown of the enlargement process, also with the absence of major treaty revisions, that have always triggered differentiation. So when you see a stagnation in European integration, that also means you see a stagnation in differentiation. And then also the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union has also led to a not major but minor decline in the overall differentiation of the Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the others would like to come in and give additional views, or maybe different views. And one thing that I'd also be especially interested in is your views on the role that crises in the EU have played with regard to differentiated integration. So is there someone who would like to come in? Bruno.
Yes, just maybe a footnote to what Frank was just saying about the drivers, the causes of differentiated integration. Maybe one needs to distinguish between the forms of differentiated integration. As Frank was also saying in this morning in the introduction, within this project, we have looked at, let's say, strong differentiated integration of the variable geometry kind, where, you know, not all member states participate in the decision-making process. But we also have what we call in the project flexibility, where common policies are being applied in a differentiated manner. Now, my impression is that for the latter, so this flexibility dimension, the value of recognition, the recognition of the diversity of political preferences does play a role. You know, it's a sort of positive recognition that diversity is useful and necessary. Whereas if we look at variable geometry, so the strong forms of differentiated integration, in my view, the main driver there is not so much this positive recognition of diversity, but rather the wish to overcome the rigidity of the system. So when a group of states want to go ahead with a new project, whether it's a big project like the Economic and Monetary Union or a small legislative project, but they face the rigidity of the EU system, either because treaty revision is not possible or because decision-making is subject to unanimity. Then what we see is that differentiated integration is being used as a veto buster, you could say, mostly, as the way forward for the integration project when faced with the opposition of one or more countries against a project. So that's, if you want, a more negative driver. It's not so much the recognition of diversity as the wish to sideline, countries that make difficulties, that are obstacles against projects which most of the others want to go ahead with. Thanks.
Marta or Micaela, would you like to come in? Both of you. So Marta, go ahead.
No, I just think that I agree with what Bruno just said, in the sense that I mean, and this reconnects a bit with what I'm going to talk about later in terms of DI in practice, in the sense that sometimes the desire to overcome stagnation leads to DI on big issues, right? And then flexibility might kick in at a later stage when policies are to be implemented for real, and then some creativity, so to say, might kick in, like Letta was saying before, because what we discover is that sometimes there are legal ways or less legal ways to modify the original DI envisaged in the treaties. So that's there is a room for flexibility and re-inclusion, even when this strong DI at the treaty level happens in treaty revisions, for example. So yeah, thanks.
And Micaela.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I would like to react to your comment, in fact, to the issue of the crisis, how they influence the use and the citizens' perspective, where I have a little bit more looked at. There seems that in times of crisis, there is a demand for a stronger or uniform Europe in certain areas, if we look at the past and the migration issue, for instance, while in a way you might see that differentiation is somehow the opposite of solidarity, precisely because in differentiation, as it was said by Frank, there is differences, heterogeneity in member states, and maybe there is an expectation from citizens that those that have better or more advanced economic capacity, administrative, institutional, would help those that are in a weaker position. So why there is this need of differentiation, there also in time of crisis, maybe there is also the need to look how differentiation is perceived from the citizen's perspective as a tool to improve and to advance, and not as a tool of granting, as he said, the veto power to some, or to not, like I say, not a prerogative, but even a privilege to those who don't want to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on this question of crises, and especially if we look at the Eurozone crisis compared to the, unfortunately, as we can see from this online conference, ongoing COVID crisis. Something we can see is that the response in terms of differentiated integration has been very, very different. And here Bruno has argued that the recovery plan, Next Gen EU, is characterized by a marked absence of differentiated integration. So to what extent is this due to the very specific let's say, context of the crisis, or to what extent do you see this as signifying maybe a decline of differentiated integration, especially when it comes to Eurozone policies? Bruno.
Yes, thank you, Katrin. I think when this project started in early 2018, or no, when it was developed, it started in 2019, of course. But in 2018, we had recently emerged from the Euro crisis, which was marked, among other things, by the use of new experiments of differentiated integration, such as, for example, the creation of the European Stability Mechanism, etc. We also had seen in 2017, like, differentiated integration coming very high on the political agenda. Remember, that was the time when the European Commission presented its 5 scenarios, of which one scenario was precisely, going ahead with differentiated integration. Those who want more, do more. That's how the Commission called it. Macron had just been elected, and he pushed also very much in his early speeches for differentiated integration. So at that time, it was very much high on the political agenda. Today, if we look at the situation today, I would say, although Enrico Letta said this morning, this is a very timely and highly topical subject, maybe it's a bit less topical than it used to be a few years ago. And one of the key elements there is, as you said, Katrin, is the way the COVID crisis has been dealt with. So there's an interesting contrast here between the European reaction to the pandemic as opposed to the European reaction to the Euro crisis, in the sense that the recovery plan, the post-COVID recovery plan adopted in December last year, is marked by the absence of differentiated integration. So the entire plan has been enacted within the bounds of the EU legal order. So there's been no use of, separate international agreements or anything like that. The plan will be implemented by all the member states, in cooperation with the main EU institutions. All 27 countries participate on the same terms. So the question is whether this marks the decline of differentiated integration, at least in economic policy, okay? There may be a different story for other policy areas, but in the field of economic policy, at least for the time being, we see a sort of halting of this development of the Eurozone into an autonomous institutional framework. There had been these Euro summits, if you remember, the Euro summits with the heads of government of the Euro states only, who were meeting. We don't have them anymore for the time being. There have been talks about having a parliamentary assembly for the Eurozone specifically, as separate from the European Parliament. It's not at all on the agenda today. There's been talk about a minister of finance for the Euro area, not on the agenda anymore. So the whole idea of a separate institutional framework for the Euro area is gone through the window, at least for the time being. So it will be interesting, of course, to see what happens towards the end of the recovery plan. Because once the recovery plan will come to an end in a few years' time, there will be a new discussion. And then we will have to see whether Eurozone specific differentiated integration will come to the foreground again or not. But for the time being, I would say that at least in this domain, which is of course a very crucial domain, namely of economic policy and fiscal policy, we have seen a decline of differentiated integration. Still, what Enrico Letta said about the importance already even today of differentiated integration may be true, but maybe in other areas. He insisted a lot on migration, but there's also other areas, of course, like defense, taxation, social policy, where DI may be very relevant in the years to come. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to stay with this just a tiny bit longer, because for me, the question would be, what has changed? Because when we look at what Frank outlined sort of as the main drivers for differentiated integration, and especially the heterogeneity when it comes to preferences, interests, and possibly also capacities of the member states, that hasn't changed. So why sort of this lack of drive for differentiated integration now with regard to Next Gen EU as compared to the Eurozone crisis? I don't know who would like to. Frank, yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons is the different context in which these decisions were made. I mean, in the 1990s, 2000s, differentiation has mainly been an instrument to facilitate the integration of new member states and to start the integration of new policies on which there was initial divides in terms of whether the EU should go in the direction of monetary integration, defense, and other issues at all. And now in the crisis, what we see is a crisis of an already existing integrated policy, where the issue does not become, do we want to go in that direction, but do we want to preserve this policy? And I think it's an effect of integration that now that these policies had already been integrated and member states had already reoriented their policies and interests towards this policy, this was really about, okay, we need to get our act together to preserve these policies and to avoid that the Eurozone, for instance, falls apart. So in that context, it's really about building the capacity to make sure that an already existing policy survives, and I think that's a very different policy in which policy context in which building common capacities, sharing, solidarity are of much higher importance than in the initial stages, and where then differentiated integration is really would not be of help, but would actually undermine the policy. So I think it's that different context and the different stage in the integration of policy that makes this difference. And indeed, yeah, what we see is that in none of the crises has differentiated integration really been the major instrument to overcome the crisis. I would not go so far as to say that the crisis had anything to do with differentiated integration. I strongly think that the causes were elsewhere, but definitely differentiated integration has not been the solution to overcome these policy crises.
Marta.
No, sorry, it's just another point that I wanted to make in a comparison between the Eurozone crisis and the COVID crisis that goes back to what Bruno was talking about and also his paper on this subject. I think it's very interesting how the choice of instrument that changed during the COVID crisis and during the Eurozone crisis and the COVID crisis, in the sense that during the COVID crisis, they went back to the EFSM, which is something which was originally used during the Eurozone crisis as a temporary emergency measure, and then it kind of disappeared or was amended in 2015, and then the ESM kind of replaced it. And then during the COVID crisis, they went back to that treaty basis, the Article 122, I think, and used this instrument again, which is undifferentiated. So there was like a switch from a very differentiated. So the end of the Eurozone crisis was the utilization of the ESM, a very differentiated tool, and the COVID response was a very undifferentiated tool, which is the EFSM. So I think it's a very interesting. It's very interesting looking at this switch and trying to understand what happened there. Just a note on this.
Thank you. And before I get to you, Bruno, I would like to add one comment from the chat, because it's also directed to you. It's a comment from Jim Claus, and he writes, decline in differentiated integration in economic affairs, true. Here the Brexit factor has played a big role, I guess, because now it is only Denmark that is not geared towards sooner or later joining the euro, and the Danish government actually would very, very much like to join the euro if only the people allowed them to. Another point, it almost sounds as if one regretted the non-use of the DI here. I think it is a positive development that we do not DI here, which is a tool to handle diversity when it's necessary to do so. I'd like to come to the normative questions a bit later on, but maybe you would like to take up Jim Claw's comment as well, Bruno.
Yes, thank you. There's just I wanted to add on the reasons why the COVID response didn't give rise to differentiated integration. We also need to look at the actual politics of the COVID crisis. And I think one of the key factors that has allowed for this unanimous consensus of all the member states behind the plan is the fact that the solution found avoided the idea of a transfer union. You know, if solidarity in this case hadn't meant that the Dutch or the German or the Finnish taxpayer had to pay to help the Greek and Italian citizens, it might have created a major, dispute between the states and maybe have led to differentiated integration. But the miracle solution, if you want, in this case was to say, well, we are going to find a 750 billion euros, not with the German taxpayer, but on the international financial markets. They're the ones who pay for the recovery plan and not the German and Dutch taxpayers. So we don't have a transfer union in this case. Maybe there will be one in the far future, but for the time being, there is no transfer union. And this has allowed the frugals, to come on board and therefore to come to a solution where everybody was happy with, and therefore no need for differentiated integration, which I consider to be a good thing. I agree with the comment on that point. Thanks.
I have two more comments from the chat. From Jonathan Zeitlin and Ton van den Brink. And they both make a similar argument, namely whether maybe the rule of law mechanism attached to Next Gen EU and especially the RRF could be indeed considered as a form of maybe negative differentiated integration, or does it sort of or is it, as Ton van den Brink argues, is it maybe more an inclusion of greater flexibility? Yeah.
Yes, to use your terms, Katrin, I think this would be a form of negative flexibility in the sense that the operation of the rule of law criteria would happen within the recovery plan. Okay, so within the allocation of money to the various countries, the rule of law conditionality would play a role in the sense that some countries might receive less from the recovery fund than they hoped because they do not comply with certain conditions related to the independence of the judiciary or non-corruption. So there would indeed then be flexibility in the implementation of this program, but in a sense, in a negative way, by punishing some countries for not complying with the rule of law standards that are being formulated. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, I don't want to trespass too much on the topic of the panel on differentiated integration and the Eurozone. So I'd like to move on to the question of how does a differentiated, or how has differentiated integration affected policy practices within the EU? And I would like to start with you, Marta, because you have worked on especially policy practices adopted by member states that have opt-outs from specific EU policies. So how do these member states deal with it, given that at the same time face interdependencies within the EU?
Thank you, Katrin. Yes, so in this, in our part of the InDivEU project, we have investigated we started by investigating differentiated integration in core state policies, so justice and home affairs, defense, and the economic and monetary union. And we started observing some kind of divergences between what's the general knowledge, what the general knowledge is about these opt-outs. So you read and you're like, okay, Denmark has an opt-out from justice and home affairs and defense. The UK have an opt-out from Schengen. I mean, the UK before Brexit, obviously, and so on and so forth. And then you investigate a bit deeper, and you talk to a Danish attaché in Brussels, and they say, well, actually, we apply all Schengen legislation. And I was like, oh, really? You apply all Schengen legislation? That's interesting. How did that happen? What we discovered by looking at policy practices is that there is lots of exceptions to the exceptions in several policy areas. So it happens that in the Danish case, for example, they had this massive opt-out clause through the Edinburgh Agreement in 1992, where they gained opt-outs from justice and home affairs, defense, the monetary union, everything. But then with the passing of time, they kind of implemented some kind of reintegration practices. So they started, for example, asking for parallel agreements to abide to the Dublin system. Then they basically wrote a very convoluted clause in the Amsterdam Treaty in order to apply all Schengen legislation. They used to apply all legislation on security and criminal cooperation, because it was actually decided through unanimity requirements, so that was fine for Denmark. So we found out that the Denmark applies lots and lots of the justice and home affairs legislation that one wouldn't expect that. And on top of that, in defense, for example, we have this newly established defense fund, which was an initiative by the Juncker Commission, actually, and it's basically a fund within the EU budget that deals with the research in the military industry and so on. And we were surprised to see that Denmark is included in this program, although Denmark should be outside any kind of initiative with defense implications. And the reason of this is that basically the European Defense Fund falls under the industry kind of policy domain and not military or defense, also because the EU budget cannot be used for military purposes. So, the policy practices can be much more complex and diverse than what the original opt-out envisages in the treaties. The same, similar things happen also in the case of the UK and Ireland with the selective opt-in and out clauses they have. So, or they had in the case of the UK. So they in the opt-out they had during Amsterdam, they managed to gain this right to basically decide whether they wanted to be part or not of a certain legislative act. And so selectively they decide whether to apply a certain legislation or not. And also in this case, there is lots of instances in which the UK and Ireland did participate in justice and home affairs and even Schengen legislation. So this is just to say that in the practices of policymaking, differentiated integration sometimes is less than what it looks. Of course, it's a fragmented scenario. It's very diverse anyways, and it's not like differentiated integration doesn't exist, but in many cases, it's diluted somehow over time and according also to the cost calculations of the states with opt-outs. So if they see lots of benefits in reintegrating certain policies, they tend to try and get in. And in many cases, the ins, so the insiders let them in. Usually, that's what happens. One exception is, for example, the UK and Ireland with Frontex. They really wanted to get in the agency for border management, and they were blocked in this, because politically the other member states thought that the UK especially couldn't have this right. Yeah, that's all.
Let me follow up on that, because we've heard earlier from Frank that sort of it is particular, and you reiterated that it is particular the sort of more the member states with more often more Eurosceptic publics that go for opt-outs, and they go for opt-outs in sort of maybe nationally more politicized areas. On the other hand, you are arguing that this is then sort of accommodated very often when it comes to the actual policy practices, so that there isn't a clear opt-out from specific areas or a full opt-out. And I also have a comment by Jim Claus in this respect, who says there is much more to the Danish opt-outs than meets the eye, and that successive Danish governments have tried to get out of the opt-outs but have failed to do so. Let me put this boldly. To what extent are opt-outs negotiated by governments? Maybe symbolic politics to appease a Eurosceptic public at home.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's always tough making this kind of argument, because that would mean, that would imply a little bit that sometimes elites tend to lie to their publics, so to say, because they they appease public by seeking differentiation symbolically, and then they do something else. But I have to say, sometimes I think it's quite obvious that this happens. Like in the Danish case, really, like even if you talk to some people who are expert in this field, to Danish decision makers or experts, they will tell you, yes, policymakers and politicians are really scared of the Danish public, because the Danish public is extremely Eurosceptic, especially when it comes to national sovereignty. So they're super hyper cautious anytime there is such a thing to debate at a high level. Also because the Danes have to go through referenda every time there is a treaty reform that requires that implies, so to say, a change in sovereignty, or like a diminishing national sovereignty, so to say. And I think that the most recent example of this, which is I think it's very telling in this sense, is what happened in 2015. So basically, the Danish decision makers wanted to get rid of this opt-out in justice and home affairs. They wanted a flexible opt-in clause like the UK had. And so they looked at polls, and they decided to launch a referendum, and they looked at polls, and they saw that the Danish public seemed to be quite favorable. They were like, okay, we are fine. They made a super positive campaign about, yes, you have to vote yes, because this is great. We need this. It's so beneficial for us. And then they lost. So they lost the referendum because the Danes were not convinced, apparently. Also, there was the refugee crisis going on, so probably that played a role. But in any case, what happened is that they had to get out of Justice and Home Affairs completely, which implied losing membership in Europol, which is a pretty important agency in terms of counterterrorism, intelligence, and so on and so forth. And immediately afterwards, the Danish politicians started negotiating a backdoor entrance to Europol with the EU. And at first, the funny intervention of Timmermans, the vice president of the Commission, was like, hey, and I quote, "You cannot be half pregnant. You can be either pregnant or not. So you cannot be half part of Europol. You have to be either part of Europol or not." That's what Timmermans replied to the Danes. And at the end of the day, what happened is that the Danes got a backdoor agreement with Europol. So they're still part of it with some, they lost some rights, but they're still in. So yes, symbolically they're out completely, fully, but in practice they do have lots of way. I mean, they have different ways to get back in, even after some kind of resistance from the EU side.
Frank, you wanted to come in on this as well.
Yes, I mean, and I was just going to make the same remark that you did, Katrin, on how this works in a specific situation when you have a Eurosceptic public, but a government that would actually, for functional reasons, like to participate. And you can extend that argument to some of the non-member states, to external differentiation as well. I mean, this is also how much of the internal market access of Switzerland also works with the EU, yeah, where there's a highly Eurosceptic public, but at a very technical level, the government finds ways around that. There's, however, a different dimension when you have differentiated integration, because countries are seen to lack the capacity to fully participate. And there, these ways around formal differentiation, of course, also help these countries to develop that capacity to some extent. Think of the participation, for instance, of countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia in the Eurozone. These countries are so far seen not to be ready to adopt the euro, but the EU offers them participation in the banking union, for instance, which could see some kind of a preparatory step towards full membership in the eurozone.
Thank you. Moving sort of to the European level and the European institutions, I would like to ask Micaela, sort of how has differentiated integration affected policymaking at the EU level, at a very practical level, and how has it affected in particular the role and the position of the European Parliament?
Yes, thank you. There have been, as you probably know, a number of resolutions of the European Parliament touching upon differentiated integration, but also enhanced cooperation. And also I linked to the previous point of Professor de Witte on separate institutional framework, whether or not we are willing to have inter-parliament and separate setting also for legitimate question in the Eurozone. Why members of the European Parliament coming from member states, non-participants, should take part in debate or even in the vote. But more in general, if I look at the most recent resolution of the Parliament of 2019, there is certainly some key points about how the Parliament see differentiated integration and which kind of differentiation is in a way the preferred one amongst the all different format and policy. And certainly one element is that I would say it should remain open. So the idea of inclusiveness, that at a certain moment in time, all the members should come on board. And therefore there is this reference to the preference to temporary arrangement and certainly not to permanent opt-out. There is also a reference, now I don't remember exactly which one of the resolution, but there is also an idea, should one day we revise the treaty, maybe we should really end permanent opt-out that so far, precisely because of this character of non-temporaneity. There is also it's a clear preference towards a multi-speed Europe, and because it seems that the other complex instrument in a way of decreased transparency and also accountability vis-a-vis of the citizens, vis-a-vis of those who elect the European Parliament. On the there is, in a way, an idea that it's the second best option. So when other solutions are not feasible, so we come to differentiating integration, and certainly there are the limits to what can be differentiated in a way. I would say that I link to what Mr. Letta was saying this morning. I was surprised to hear this idea of differentiated integration towards the rule of law, because in a way it's a very limit, so that the EU value as they are in Article 2 are certain. Somebody even called the Holy Trinity: democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, and the rule of law, so non-negotiable. But then I understood better what Mr. Letta was saying, in a sense, differentiation in sorts of enforcement, of a mechanism to enforce the rule of law, similar to what we have with the conditionality mechanism now for the EU budget. And my last point on the whether or not is for the Parliament would be suitable on a separate institutional framework, I must say that for a long time the Parliament is not in favor of a second Parliament for a number of reasons. I think that the most mentioned one is the fact that the members of Parliament represent the citizens of the Union, not the citizens of their own constituency. And also for other reasons, like the fact that maybe internally the Parliament could find other arrangements that does not impinge the free mandate of the members of Parliament, like creating subcommittees or creating system internals to deal specifically when it comes to differentiated integration. And last, of course, there was a kind of reflection how to come on board when it comes to differentiated integration, the view of the national parliament. And there also there was some debate how to have a sort of more enhanced role in collaboration with the European Parliament.
Thank you. When it comes to differentiated integration in the form of, let's say, intergovernmental agreements among a subgroup of member states, would you say that one of the, let me just put it as accompanying characteristics, is that it leads to a diminished role of the European Parliament, because it is at times kept out of the decision-making process?
Well, I would say, yes, there is, it's for Parliament a clear preference for form that remain within the communitaries instead of the internal governmental system, precisely because of the role of Parliament and accountability of the system.
And I think that also raises important questions with regard to sort of differentiated integration on the one hand and the legitimacy of EU policy making on the other hand. I'd like to come to that a bit further on. I'd go, no, in fact, in light of the time, let's move on to exactly those normative questions. You have partly touched upon this in some of the comments you have made, but overall, does differentiated integration pose a threat to the EU polity? So do we see an ever more fragmented union rather than an ever closer union? Or would you say it is at the end one or maybe even the means for the EU to actually protect its polity and the European integration project in some form, given the growing heterogeneity between the member states, growing conflicts? Is it the only way out of current reform deadlocks? This is a question to all of you, whoever wants to come in. Bruno.
Yes, I think that if we look at what happened in the past decades, then as Frank Schimmelfennig has also argued, differentiated integration has been a positive force for European integration, in the sense that it has allowed progress in certain fields of cooperation to happen despite, different preferences of the member states. So this started with Schengen, of course, which is the classical example, but there have been more cases like that. What about the future? What about now and the future? I think that differentiated integration is not so much of a threat because it's subject to rather strict conditions and constraints. So it's not so easy for states to engage in new projects of differentiated integration, at least as long as they respect the integrity of the EU legal system, which most of them do. Then they have to abide with the rules. And if we take, for example, the conclusion of separate international agreements between groups of member states, there it's quite clear that this can only happen in full respect of existing obligations of states under EU law. So this cannot be used to modify existing policies by a group of countries who are not happy with it. So what separate agreements can do is to add on, to engage in cooperation in new areas, to go beyond the existing acquis of the European Union. And if we look at enhanced cooperation, which is the other main form that is available today for differentiated integration, it's quite constrained by the rules and conditions in the treaties. And that, I think, has to do with the origins. If we think of the time when enhanced cooperation was first introduced in the system, namely at the time of the Treaty of Amsterdam, it was really meant as a way of controlling differentiated integration, of avoiding states to go outside the system to try to keep member states within the EU system and subject to certain constraints. Now, one of these constraints is the last resort rule. So enhanced cooperation should only be used if the normal decision-making mechanism doesn't work, doesn't allow for the decision to be taken. And also enhanced cooperation is marked by this right for each member state to participate. Each member state can not only participate in enhanced cooperation when it starts, but they can also join later on, whenever they want, basically. So that is, I think, a very important legal constraint, which is written in the treaties, because it means that enhanced cooperation cannot be used for the creation of a pioneer group or a vanguard of states that would cooperate across a whole range of areas. It means that enhanced cooperation basically can only be used for what it has been used so far, namely for piecemeal legislative projects, specific projects on which, because of unanimity or because of some other reasons, you cannot get to a normal EU decision, and then you can move to enhanced cooperation. Now, just a footnote on that. I was struck by the fact that Enrico Letta emphasized a lot the use of enhanced cooperation in the field of migration. Now, what is interesting is that in the field of migration, the European Union actually decides by qualified majority. All basic decisions on migration and asylum policy today are subject to qualified majority voting. So this is not an area in which you need enhanced cooperation to overcome the veto of one country because of the unanimity rule. But it's still, I think he still has a point, because it's an area in which the states are very divided, and beyond the veto of one single country, what we see is very different positions and preferences by groups of countries in that field. So who knows? Maybe migration might be an area in which for the first time enhanced cooperation would be used, even though qualified majority voting is legally possible.
But I think that's that only shows that reform deadlocks are not just caused by the unanimity rule. Reform deadlocks can also clearly happen in areas where we have already moved to qualified majority voting. I have a question from the chat exactly on that to Micaela from Jonathan Zeitlin. How might the EP react to Letta's proposal for a new Schengen Treaty on migration and asylum, in which a group of member states would go ahead with more ambitious common policies and would exclude from free internal movement other member states that are not willing to accept the resulting obligations. So again, the proposal that Bruno just referred to, what would be the EP's view on that?
Of course, I cannot speak for the institution. I can only say, looking back, I was also surprised by the suggestion, and in a way for historical reasons. So I remember that when in 2019, in relation to the search and rescue operation in the Mediterranean, there were 4 member states, including Italy, Malta, that put forward a kind of proposal for a binding mechanism, and it was not really follow-up. So I think that in differentiated integration, there is also a kind of how many member states have to be on board to ensure that in a way that there is sufficient traction for the others to follow. That's also the principle Professor de Witte was mentioned in ENS cooperation, at least 9 member states. And all these by procedural and substantial conditions that in a way limit the use of the mechanism, maybe 4 or 5 times has been used since the Lisbon Treaty. Now I don't have the figures. Most recently with the European Public Prosecutor. Although we see that once enhanced cooperation is in place, I might say there is a substantial members, because for HEPO are 22 member states, and for the other mechanism, the other enhanced cooperation, at least between 18 and 17 members of both. So when it's in place, there is a certain willingness from member states to follow. As to your question originally, I will come back later. I'll let the others reply.
Thank you, because I would like to come in on that exactly with a question to Marta from Raquel Ugarte, which sort of alludes to this pull factor that you just mentioned, Micaela, sort of this hope that once a smaller group of member states goes ahead, the others will join back in. And this is what this question also relates to. So when it comes to differentiated integration in practice, would you say the attempts to join through a back door of countries with opt-outs is motivated more by a fear of missing out, FOMO, or is it the fear of losing influence in this area, so this whole sovereignty influence trade-off, or are there completely other motivations?
Well, I guess it depends, right? Because I mean, there is research about, for example, bureaucratic politics that looks at bureaucrats in Brussels, Danish bureaucrats in Brussels, also British and Irish, that try to be involved in the decision making of policy areas in which they're not supposed to decide anything because they have an opt-out. So there is that side that tries to compensate from the losing decision making power. And on the other hand, there is the practices which are even put in place without having rights of decision making, which is the case of Denmark in many Schengen policies, for example. And in that case, I think it's this fear of missing out, I guess, of being not part of the system rather than losing the decision making authority. Then it depends at what level you look at, right? I mean, if you look at the bureaucrats, then you find out that they try to find ways to be in touch with the other decision makers, and on the other hand, they want to put policies in place and be within specific systems or capacities, so participate in funds to finance certain policies, to be part of the agencies, especially because they are gaining ground in the policy implementation and in raising equipment and funds to deal with, for example, migration and asylum issues. And if I can add on this, on the impact of differentiated integration, I think I would like to make a point about the importance of policy implementation in general, because decision making and the policies that come out of the decision making are obviously important, because that's the EU legislation, and the EU legislation is what it's the blueprint for states to implement policies, but it happens many times that the states don't do that or don't do that properly. And that's not even differentiated integration. Maybe it's what they call differentiated implementation. But anyway, states use their discretion in many different ways to apply EU law. And sometimes it's highly differentiated too. So I think that goes kind of beyond of the scope of DI somehow, but it's also very, very important in assessing where we are going and how effective EU policies are after all.
Thank you. Frank, I believe you wanted to come in, yeah.
Yeah, just a few brief points on your original question about, let's say, the legitimacy and also the impact on the EU as a polity. Yeah, I think we can safely say that without differentiated integration, the EU would be much smaller and also less integrated today. So it has definitely served both the deepening and the widening of the European Union. In addition, most of the differentiations that we have studied have actually been temporary. And also, what I think is also important is that, yes, it creates these core peripheral Europe division to some extent, but core Europe has always been open and inclusive. Yeah, so it's differentiation has never been used to close the doors to some of the member states. It's rather that some member states have decided not to pass through this door. So I think this inclusiveness and openness is an important feature of the legitimacy of differentiation in the EU. Third point, it's actually also quite popular with the citizens. Yeah? So the work on public opinion that we've done shows that there is on average overwhelming support for differentiated integration. Of course, you have to look a little bit at what kind and for what countries, but overall, we have seen actually even in increasing support over time. One other concern has been, well, yeah, that differentiation might weaken the EU and might actually make it more crisis prone. I don't think that this is the case. I think none of the crises that the EU has gone through has had its causes in the EU being differentiated. Might be a more contested statement to say that maybe had the EU been more differentiated, the crisis might not have been so severe. Yeah, I mean, if the Eurozone had been more differentiated, if the EU had been willing to introduce more flexibility in its negotiations, in its early negotiations with the UK, we might have avoided Brexit. These are difficult counterfactuals, but I think they are worth pondering. On the other hand, and this is my final point, I would say there are clear limitations of differentiated integration when it comes to the current EU reforms. And it is my perception that current EU reforms or the need for reform, this is really on issues having to do with, say, fundamental values, institutional issues on the one hand, and with issues of redistribution in already advanced integrated policy areas. And I think both these policy characteristics, redistribution and, say, value and institutional issues, are the ones that are least amenable to a differentiated treatment. So I actually see differentiated integration as a less important feature of moving the European Union forward than it had been in the 1990s and 2000s.
Thank you. That, of course, answers to some extent also the question whether differentiated integration can be a means to overcome the deadlocks with regard to fundamental reforms in the EU at the moment, because a number of them concern constitutional issues, fundamental issues of the rule of law, of human rights, of discrimination in the EU, but also questions of redistribution, as you mentioned, migration, financial and EMU issues. Are those in the in the eyes of the others? Are these topics which with regard to which differentiated integration should be completely off the table? Where are these issues where differentiated integration is not a way forward? And in that context, let me also read a comment by Ilke Teugür, who very much agrees with the Holy Trinity, Micaela. DI should not be applicable to rule of law unless it is to encourage solidifying integration via the use of funds, etc. So on the one hand, those are the big topics, or some of the big topics for reform, some of the big sources of conflicts within the EU. And at the same time, are they too fundamental or too much concerned with redistributive questions to make differentiated integration here in any way a means to be used? Puna.
Well, the rule of law debate is, of course, I mean, we all know why differentiated integration is not a solution. And that's why I found Enrico Letta's comment on this really paradoxical, because we know that the problem is with particular countries, you know? We know which countries they are. So what's the point of having differentiated integration among the others on rule of law if the real problem is with the countries who would not participate in that differentiated integration?
If I can come in, one argument that only then to make a counter argument, but one of the arguments that Frank sort of takes up in one of his articles is differentiating integration when it comes to rule of law or to anti-discrimination legislation in the EU, etc., would be that it differentiated integration could allow some member states to deviate from the common rules within the EU, and that would not have externalities or negative external effects on the other member states. So if Poland decides to go a different way with regard to anti-discrimination laws when it comes to the LGBTQ community, that does not affect anti-discrimination legislation for the rest of the EU. Again, this is not, I want to stress, this is not Frank's argument. He just makes that point as a devil's advocate only then to argue against it.
No, that's true. Of course, there's no externality of the policies of specific countries in the field. But yeah, I think we can all agree that these are considered to be common values, that the European project is about ensuring, you know, a common level playing field, if you want, when it comes to the independence of the judiciary, to non-discrimination, to the functioning of democracy. That is like the ground on which we agree to cooperate also in other fields. And so I think to actively promote differentiated integration in those fields seems not very interesting. On the contrary, seems to be really a form of disintegration of what we are trying to achieve in Europe. I think there are other fields, but maybe that's for a later point, other fields in which we may still have differentiated integration in the future. I don't think it's completely out of the window. I think of taxation, I think of social policy. So there are certainly important policy areas in which we could see a revival of different forms of differentiated integration in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you. Frank?
Yeah, I think in all fairness to what Enrico Letta said, I think his proposal was not to have differentiated integration with regard to the rule of law, but to use differentiated integration as some kind of a sanctioning mechanism. Yeah. so to say, which is of course what is already happening, and it has been commented on in the chat as well. Yeah, that and this is basically the only way out here would be to say, okay, we have to link this policy domain to other policy domains in which we can actually apply differentiated integration that will hurt those countries that violate the rule of law. So the point here is, would it be possible to make that linkage? And then it's already happening with regard to next gen, and it's already happening, or it might happen soon with regard to the rule of law conditionality, where the Commission is starting to become active, also thanks to the pressure of the European Parliament. So here, I think that's the issue, and I think it's also the same issue for migration. I mean, it is difficult to implement differentiated integration, or it defeats its purpose if by differentiating you actually give some countries, say, a way out of their obligations. Yeah? And this is what would be happening in the rule of law. It would be happening in the case of migration. So you have to link it to some other policies, or you basically, what you would have to do, and there have been proposals in this way, you basically introduce a new agreement, a new treaty that supersedes, let's say, the existing Schengen Dublin rules with tougher obligations on, for instance, the distribution of asylum seekers. But I think, yes, theoretically, that seems to be a way out. I just see that it's extremely hard to do in practice, yeah, to overcome an already existing treaty by basically refounding the European Union with those that are willing to move ahead with tougher rules. I really don't see that this is feasible.
Yeah, because as you said, it would give some member states sort of a carte blanche to go free riding. And yeah, Jonathan Zeitlin made an important point with regard to sort of differentiated integration and anti-discrimination legislation in the EU. I think that's very true. He says, wouldn't allowing Poland, for example, to discriminate in the field of LGBTQ rights create externalities for other member states as regards free movement? For example, LGBTQ citizens of those member states moving to Poland for employment or being posted service delivery purposes. I hope I'm not butchering this. Yes, I think that is a very good point. So would it then be sort of necessary to agree on a core area of values, not just the constitutional areas, but also when it comes to issues such as migration? We've talked about EMU there. Frank, you make a similar argument about differentiated integration, basically leading to two blocks, in which on the one hand you have the financially more vulnerable member states, and on the who have expectations when it comes to EU policies, and on the other hand you have the financially stronger, healthier member states who wouldn't want to engage in these kinds of policies, and therefore any kind of differentiated integration would also defeat the purpose of sort of generating common EU policies and overcoming deadlock. So to what extent does that reopen the whole solidarity question within the EU, the whole question of sort of what are the the fundamental principles. And here I don't just mean human rights and anti-discrimination, but going beyond that, what are the fundamental values and principles that this EU is founded on and that are simply non-negotiable, and therefore cannot be subject to differentiated integration. Bruno.
First, maybe on Jonathan's point, I think he's quite right, of course, is that if you have very different practices in terms of discrimination of minorities, of groups of people in one country, that will affect free movement. Also, when the EU's competence to deal with discrimination was created at the time of the Treaty of Amsterdam, and when then the first directives on the non-discrimination were adopted, the free movement argument was also used, saying that you cannot have true free movement of workers, of people in the EU if people are being treated in different ways. It's always been a very secondary argument. I think that the main reason why we have discrimination legislation on the EU is because we believe in common values. It's not so much, I think, about facilitating free movement. It's an additional argument, of course, but the main argument why we want Poland to comply with a common standard of non-discrimination is because we believe in common values in the European Union, quite apart from the impact on free movement. Now, just moving to what you just said, Katrin, about financial solidarity. I think financial solidarity is very much negotiable today. It's not a non-negotiable subject. It's the subject of the biggest negotiations. And so we haven't reached a point where financial solidarity between member states is seen as an accepted common value. On the contrary, I'd say that in countries like the Netherlands, or like Austria, or like Finland, or like Germany, there is no strong sense of financial solidarity across the borders. So I think the masterpiece of the COVID recovery plan is precisely that it has allowed the adoption of what is a measure of financial solidarity, because the allocation of the recovery plan favors the weaker economies and the poorer member states. It has allowed to do so by hiding the fact that there is redistribution. So the solidarity, the financial solidarity aspect of the recovery plan is hidden. It's not upfront. It's not clearly expressed. The language of the recovery plan is more of we're all facing the same problem. The COVID, the pandemic, we all have to deal with it in the same way, and therefore let's have a common plan. And in between, half hidden, there is also an element of redistribution, of helping the economies that are struggling most with the recovery and more generally with their economic performance. So that's the furthest we've got so far. That's what we can achieve in the European Union. We can achieve financial solidarity if it's packaged in a way which makes it acceptable for the public opinions in the frugal countries. Thanks.
Yes, Micaela.
Yes, I just want to react to your question about the fundamental value. Of course, I do believe the Article 2 are really the fundamental values, and the treaty recognizes the national identity, but still while complying with those values. So discriminatory legislation in one member state will not compliant with the fundamental value, as Professor de Witte say, we all signed when we entered the club of the European member states. There are other principles like the solidarity and sincere cooperation that might help in some case, as it was mentioned, but still, if we look at the migration and the absence of solidarity in practice, in a sense, still yesterday, in reaction to the crisis at the border of Poland and Belarus, the Commission put forward a proposal for a Council decision based on emergency measures, so the Article 78. So after, 6 years or 7 years from the previous migratory crisis, we still are acting by emergency measure instead of operationalize the concept of solidarity. In that area, even though unanimity is not required, maybe it's differentiation is an area where, if we have sufficient number of member states, not only those in need of help, maybe there is a way to use this instrument.
Thank you. Let me quickly encourage everyone watching to post again their questions in the chat, or post comments in the chat, because we have about another 8 or 9 minutes, and I'd love to put forward some more questions or comments from the audience, if there are. I have a question from, oh my God, I'm going to butcher this. Myung-hun Lee. I'm very sorry if I really didn't pronounce this correctly. It isn't to no one in particular, so it goes out to all panelists. How can we understand the delay of the joining of Romania and Bulgaria to Schengen? Are these rule of law issues? Is this the immigration crisis? I think the competition between member states would be a factor of differentiated integration between Western Europe as the core group and the group of Visegrad. What are your thoughts on that? And if I may add something like that, that's probably a topic too big to be discussed in the last 8 minutes. But I was struck by the fact that there was sort of this reinforcement from everyone saying that we share these common values in the EU. But given the developments in some of the member states, is that actually still the case? Or are these common values shared by the majority of member states, that does not universally apply to all of them? So clearly there are different values when it comes to anti-discrimination. There are also different values when it comes to how to interpret democracy as a concept and how that should work. So I'm just throwing this in here because the mention was made of sort of, on the one hand, having sort of the former core Europe, Western Europe, and the Visegrad countries. Marta.
Sorry, just a quick comment on the rule of law and I mean shared common values more in general. I was just thinking of Italy recently, in the recent year. The past year there was this long debate about this anti-discrimination law being passed by the Italian Parliament. And basically this law was finally watered down. It's not gonna be voted. It's dead, basically. And the day that the Parliament succeeded to water down this proposal, there were lots of members of the Parliament clapping their hands and being incredibly happy because they managed not to have an anti-discrimination law passed by the Parliament. And you know, Italy is. I mean, we're not in the we don't belong to the Eastern countries where it's not Poland, it's not Hungary, but still something like this I think is an indicator that sometimes these shared and common values that the EU should be made of, that the ideal of the European Union kind of embraces, it's not necessarily uniform in many countries. And you know, as far as, I mean, as much as we were shocked about what happened in the Italian Parliament, how surprising that would be, that in Italy these days the Parliament would be so overwhelmingly against such kind of legislation. This happens. So so one more reason, I think, to try to make it more to make it probably easier to punish violations in this regard in the European Union, because if the EU is made of these values, then it shouldn't be that easy to go astray and against them in each country, right?
Is there anyone who wants to come in specifically on this? Frank, perfect. I also have one more question, so if you could keep it short.
Yes, on the issue of Romania and Bulgaria and Schengen. So the original policy was, well, if you join the European Union as a new member state, you do not automatically get access to all of the policies. That includes the Eurozone and Schengen. And there's a separate vote of the old member states that need to check, whether new member states facilitate meet the more specific requirements for joining Schengen. Now, there is ongoing concern, I think mainly in Germany and France, even though the Commission recommends that these countries join Schengen and basically says they meet the technical requirements, but I think there's basically ongoing concern that because of administrative capacity and other issues, that letting these countries into Schengen would hamper the EU's goals of having effective border control and might facilitate unwanted immigration. So it really has turned more into a political issue, into a politicized issue. And I think this is one of the cases where old member states use their power as gatekeepers in a way that might actually undermine the inclusiveness and also the legitimacy of of differentiated integration, if on the other hand you have a clear recommendation by the Commission saying, okay, they meet the requirements.
I have a final question from Gary Marks, who would like, this opens up a completely new topic, and given that we have only 3 more minutes, but maybe someone wants to touch upon this. It's also, I think, going to be subject of a panel later, but he would like to ask the panelists to place differentiation in the context of geopolitics. Does the EU's position in the US-China conflict have any effects of differentiation in the EU? Bruno.
I'll give it a little try, but as you said, Katrin, this is really a big question and on a different matter. But in terms of the legal framework of differentiated integration, what is interesting in this respect is that trade and investment policies are exclusive EU competences, and exclusive competences are not subject to differentiated integration. So enhanced cooperation is not allowed, and separate international treaties by groups of states are not allowed either. So there, the legal arguments are in the hands of the European Union and of the Commission. Now, that's trade and investment, but then of course there's the rest of foreign relations where, there's room for member state action. And that's what we see, of course, is that in the relationship with China, more broadly speaking, there are different views of states, and it's much more difficult for the European Union to come up with a common line. But I think what is interesting here is that trade and investment, which are defined very broadly, it includes now, of course, the whole idea of sustainable development, climate change, and all these things. There, the European Union basically is in a strong position to impose uniformity on all its member states, including in the relationship with China and with the United States. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me close with one remark that also takes up a question from Paolo Cierchetti, or a comment who mentions that the new German coalition government has proposed a constitutional convention leading to a federal European state. And I wonder whether that will have any impact at all on the ongoing conference of the European Union, for which the member states, as you know, have already taken institutional reform basically off the table. I have also looked at the reform of the two treaties, I'm sorry, off the table. I've also had a look at the reports that have come out of the citizen panel deliberations of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And interestingly, there is a lot of demand for closer cooperation, and there is very, very little, if at all, in terms of demands for differentiated integration. So I'll use that to close the panel for today, to thank you very, very much for your contributions, for the discussion. Thank you also to all of the members in the audience for your comments and for your questions. I hope I got to them all and didn't overlook any of them. Thank you so much.